The dust-laden air of Copper Creek, Wyoming Territory, carried whispers like tumbleweeds across the parched main street as Jessie Northup clutched her swollen belly and stepped off the stagecoach. The year was 1875, and the promise of a new beginning had drawn her westward from Boston's suffocating propriety, but the journey had nearly broken her. 20 years old, unwed, and 7 months with child, she faced the scrutiny of narrowed eyes and hushed judgments from the moment her worn boots touched the rutted dirt. "Another fallen dove come to roost," muttered a woman standing outside the general store, her voice deliberately loud enough to reach Jessie's ears. Jessie straightened her spine despite the ache in her lower back and adjusted the small valise in her hand. Her free hand rested protectively over her belly, a reflexive gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The letter from her cousin Martha promising work and shelter was safely tucked in her pocket, her only lifeline in this frontier town. "Miss? Need help with your bags?" The voice belonged to a boy no more than 12, eager to earn a penny. "Thank you," Jessie said, handing him her larger trunk. "I'm headed to Widow Parker's boarding house." The boy's eyes widened slightly. "That's clear across town, madam." "I can manage," Jessie replied, though her feet already throbbed from the long journey. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel sweat trickling between her shoulder blades beneath her faded blue dress. As they made their way down the dusty street, Jessie felt the weight of stares following her progress. The older woman's weathered face showed the marks of frontier life, but her eyes were kind as she embraced her young cousin. "You made it, child. Come in before you melt in this heat." Inside the modest parlor, Martha poured Jessie a glass of cool water and settled her into a chair. "You're looking peaked from the journey. How's the little one?" "Active," Jessie replied with a weak smile, placing a hand on her belly. "Especially at night when I'm trying to sleep." Martha nodded sympathetically. "Well, you're safe now. I've told folks you're my widowed niece come to help with the boarding house. It won't stop all the talk, but it might soften it." "Thank you," Jessie whispered, tears threatening. "I don't know what I would have done without your letter." "Family's family," Martha said firmly. "Now, I've set up a room for you upstairs, but there's something you should know." She hesitated. "The position at the school I mentioned, it's gone. The mayor's niece arrived last month, and they gave it to her instead." Jessie's heart sank. Without work, how would she support herself and the baby? "Don't fret," Martha continued, seeing Jessie's expression. "I've spoken with Doc Williams. He needs help at his clinic, just keeping records and tidying up. Nothing too strenuous. He's a good man who doesn't ask too many questions." "When can I start?" Jessie asked, determination replacing her momentary despair. "Tomorrow, if you're up to it. For now, rest. I'll bring up some supper later." Jessie's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window that overlooked the main street. She unpacked her meager belongings, a few dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush, and a small wooden box containing her mother's locket and her father's pocket watch. Everything she had left in the world. As she sat by the window watching the town's evening activities unfold, Jessie placed a hand on her belly and made a silent promise to her unborn child. They would build a life here, away from the shame and rejection of Boston society. She would work hard and give this baby everything she could. They would survive. They had to. Dawn arrived with the cacophony of a frontier town, waking wagons rumbling down the street, shopkeepers opening their establishments, and roosters announcing the new day with persistent crowing. Jessie dressed carefully in her best dress, a navy blue cotton with white piping that Martha had quickly altered the night before to accommodate her growing belly. "You look lovely," Martha assured her over a breakfast of cornbread and preserves. "Doc Williams is expecting you at 8 o'clock. The medical clinic was a modest whitewashed building with a clean-swept porch and windows that gleamed in the morning light. Jessie hesitated at the door, smoothing her dress nervously before knocking. Dr. Williams was older than she expected, with silver-streaked hair and spectacles perched on a prominent nose. His eyes were kind, however, as he welcomed her inside. "Mrs. Northup, welcome. Martha speaks highly of your organizational abilities." He gestured to a cluttered desk. "As you can see, I'm in dire need of someone to bring order to my chaos." Jessie appreciated the use of Mrs., though they both knew it was a courtesy rather than truth. "I'll do my best, doctor," she replied, already assessing the stacks of patient records and correspondence. I have rounds to make this morning. Take your time getting acquainted with the system or lack thereof, he said with a self-deprecating smile. There's tea in the back room if you'd like some. Left alone, Jessie set to work immediately, grateful for the task. Organization had always been her strength, and by midday, she had created a sensible filing system for patient records and cleared much of the paperwork cluttering the doctor's desk. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the clinic door open. The sound of spurs jingling finally caught her attention, and she looked up to find herself facing a tall man in dust-covered clothes, his broad-brimmed hat held in calloused hands. "Pardon, madam," he said, his voice deep and tinged with a slight southern drawl. "Doc Williams around?" Jessie stood carefully, one hand instinctively going to her back to support her weight. "He's making house calls. Can I help you with something?" The man's eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, flickered briefly to her belly before returning to her face with careful politeness. "Name's Dillon Calloway. My ranch hand took a bad fall this morning. Nothing broken, but he's hurting something fierce. Was hoping the doc might spare some laudanum." "I believe I can help with that," Jessie replied, moving toward the medicine cabinet. Dr. Williams left instructions for common requests. As she measured the tincture into a small brown bottle, she could feel the man's, Mr. Calloway's, eyes on her. Not judging, she decided after a furtive glance, just curious. "You're new to Copper Creek," he observed as she handed him the medicine. "Yes, I arrived yesterday. I'm staying with my aunt, Martha Parker." "The widow Parker," he nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Fine woman. Makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. "So I've heard," Jessie replied, finding herself returning his smile. "Well, Mrs. Northup." "Jessie Northup. Mrs. Northup," he repeated, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for the medicine. I'll settle up with Doc next time I'm in town." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of leather, horses, and sun-warmed earth. The remainder of Jessie's first day passed quickly. When Dr. Williams returned, he was visibly impressed with her progress. "You've accomplished more in a day than I have in a month," he exclaimed, examining the newly organized filing system. "I do believe this arrangement will work out splendidly. Thank you for giving me the opportunity," Jessie replied sincerely. "How are you feeling?" the doctor asked, his professional gaze assessing her condition. "Martha mentioned you're due in about 2 months. "I'm well," Jessie assured him. "Just tired from the journey. I'd like to examine you, if you're amenable, just to be certain everything is progressing as it should." Jessie agreed, and after a thorough but respectful examination, Dr. Williams pronounced both mother and baby to be in good health. "You're carrying high," he observed. "Old wives would say that means a boy." Jessie smiled. "My mother would have been pleased. She always wanted a grandson." As Jessie walked back to the boarding house that evening, she felt a fragile sense of hope beginning to take root. Perhaps here, in this frontier town where people were too busy carving out their own lives to dwell overlong on the circumstances of others, she and her child might find acceptance. That hope was tested the very next day when she encountered Mrs. Abigail Foster, the mayor's wife, outside the mercantile. The older woman made a point of crossing to the other side of the street, her nose elevated as though catching the scent of something unpleasant. "Don't mind her," said a friendly voice behind Jessie. She turned to find a young woman with curly red hair and a freckled face smiling at her. "I'm Rose Sullivan. I run the dressmaker's shop." "Jessie Northup," she replied, grateful for the friendly face. "I know," Rose said with a wink. "News travels fast in Copper Creek. You're the widow staying at Martha Parker's and working for Doc Williams." Jessie nodded, uncomfortable with the lie but knowing its necessity. "Well, if you need anything altered to accommodate the little one," Rose gestured to Jessie's belly, "come see me. First alterations free for newcomers, my welcome to town gift." "That's very kind," Jessie said, genuinely touched. "Us women have to stick together out here," Rose replied with another wink. "Stop by the shop anytime. I'll make a mean cup of tea, and I've got all the best gossip." As the weeks passed, Jessie settled into a routine. Mornings and afternoons at the clinic, evenings helping Martha with the boarding house guests. She became acquainted with more townspeople, some welcoming, others coldly polite or openly disapproving. Dr. Williams proved to be an excellent employer, treating her with respect and gradually teaching her more about his practice. Jessie discovered she had an aptitude for medicine and absorbed his lessons eagerly. "You'd have made a fine doctor yourself," he told her one day after she correctly identified a patient's ailment before he did. "Women aren't doctors," she replied automatically, repeating what she'd been told all her life. "Nonsense," he scoffed. "There are women doctors back east now. Times are changing, Mrs. Northup, even if they change slowly." The idea planted a seed in Jessie's mind. Could she possibly? But no, she would have a child to raise soon. Dreams of education would have to wait. Dillon Calloway returned to the clinic several times over those weeks, once for medicine for his foreman's wife, again for supplies after one of his men suffered a burn, and a third time claiming he needed something for headaches, though he appeared perfectly healthy. Each time, they spoke a little longer, and Jessie found herself looking forward to his visits. There was something solid and reassuring about him, like the mountains visible on the horizon beyond town, steady, unflinching, and somehow timeless. She learned he ran the Circle C Ranch, one of the largest operations in the territory. He'd come west after the war, where he'd fought for the Union despite his Virginia upbringing. He spoke little of his past beyond that, but Jessie sensed there were shadows there, just as there were in her own history. On his fourth visit, he arrived just as Jessie was closing the clinic for the day. "Evening, Mrs. Northup." He greeted her, removing his hat as always. "Doc around. He's visiting a patient at the edge of town," Jessie replied, locking the clinic door. "Can I help with something?" Dillon cleared his throat. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you." He shifted his weight slightly, betraying an uncharacteristic nervousness. "I wonder if you might permit me to escort you home." Jessie blinked in surprise. "That's very kind, Mr. Calloway, but it's only a short walk." "All the same, I'd consider it an honor," he persisted gently. Something in his earnest expression made it impossible to refuse. "Very well," she agreed. They walked side by side down the main street, Dillon shortening his long stride to match her slower pace. The evening was pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage from the surrounding hills. "I understand you lost your husband recently," he said after they'd walked in silence for a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss." Jessie felt her cheeks warm with shame at the lie. "Thank you," she murmured, looking away. Dillon seemed to sense her discomfort. "I lost someone too," he offered unexpectedly. "Not a wife, but someone I cared for. During the war." The genuine pain in his voice made Jessie look up at him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded, his blue eyes distant with memory. "It was a long time ago now, but I learned that grief doesn't follow any schedule. It comes and goes like weather." They reached the boarding house all too soon. Dillon paused at the bottom of the steps. "Mrs. Northup, Jessie," he amended, his voice low. "I'd like to call on you properly sometime, if you'd permit it." Jessie stared at him, bewildered. "Mr. Calloway, I'm—" She gestured helplessly at her very obvious pregnancy. "I can see that," he replied, a gentle smile softening his weathered features. "Then why would you want to call on me?" "Because in the few conversations we've had, I've found you to be intelligent, kind, and brave," he answered simply. "Those qualities are rare enough to make me want to know you better." Before Jessie could formulate a response, Martha opened the front door. "There you are, Jessie. And Mr. Calloway, too. Would you care to stay for supper?" "We've got plenty." Dillon glanced at Jessie, who found herself nodding despite her confusion. "I'd be obliged, Mrs. Parker," he replied. Supper was a surprisingly comfortable affair. Martha kept the conversation flowing, and Jessie discovered that Dillon had a dry wit that frequently made her laugh. By the time he took his leave, the evening shadows had lengthened into full darkness. "You're welcome anytime, Mr. Calloway," Martha told him at the door. "It's nice to see Jessie smiling." After he left, Martha turned to Jessie with raised eyebrows. "That man rode 5 miles into town just to walk you home and have supper with us." "He said he wants to call on me," Jessie admitted, still bewildered. Martha smiled knowingly. "Of course he does. He's been sweet on you since your first meeting, if the gossip is accurate. But I'm—" Jessie again gestured to her belly. "A woman carrying another man's child?" Martha finished bluntly. "Dillon Calloway doesn't strike me as the kind of man who'd hold that against you. Besides, out here in the territories, people are more practical." A good woman is a good woman, regardless of circumstances. That night, as Jessie prepared for bed, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that Dillon might genuinely be interested in her. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. But could she trust it? Edward had made promises too, before disappearing when she told him about the baby. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby kicked vigorously. Jessie placed a hand on her belly. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Is Mr. Calloway sincere, or are we setting ourselves up for more heartache?" The baby kicked again, and Jessie laughed softly. "You're right. We'll be cautious." True to his word, Dillon called on Jessie the following Sunday afternoon. He arrived at the boarding house with his horse freshly groomed and wearing a clean shirt, his hair still damp from washing. "I thought you might enjoy a drive," he suggested, gesturing to a buggy waiting in the street. "It's a fine day, and there's a spot by the creek that's real pretty this time of year." With Martha's encouraging nods, Jessie found herself seated beside Dillon in the buggy, a light blanket across her lap despite the warm day. They drove out of town, following a winding dirt road that paralleled a creek lined with cottonwoods and willows. "How are you finding Copper Creek?" Dillon asked as they traveled. "Besides the usual small-town gossip, that is." Jessie smiled, appreciating his directness. "It's different from Boston in every way imaginable, but I'm beginning to think that's a good thing." "Boston," he repeated. "That explains your accent. I wondered where you were from." "Do I have an accent?" Jessie asked, surprised. Dillon chuckled. "To my ears, yes. It's in how you pronounce certain words. It's nice, though. Refined." They arrived at a shady spot where the creek widened into a small pool. Dillon helped Jessie down from the buggy with careful hands, then spread a blanket on a patch of soft grass. "It's beautiful here," Jessie said, looking at the way the sunlight dappled through the leaves overhead. "Found it my first year in the territory," Dillon replied, settling beside her on the blanket. "I come here sometimes to think." They talked easily as the afternoon progressed. Dillon told her about his ranch, the challenges of the harsh winters, the satisfaction of a successful spring calving, the constant battles against predators and cattle rustlers. Jessie spoke of her childhood in Boston, her love of books, and her brief experience as a teacher's assistant before coming west. Neither mentioned her pregnancy directly, though when the baby kicked hard enough to make Jessie gasp mid-sentence, Dillon's eyes softened with something like wonder. "May I?" he asked hesitantly, his hand hovering above her belly. Surprised but touched by the request, Jessie nodded. Dillon placed his large, calloused palm gently against the swell of her abdomen. A moment later, the baby kicked again, and his face broke into a wide, delighted grin. "Strong little thing," he remarked. "Too strong sometimes," Jessie replied with a rueful smile. "Especially at night." As the sun began to lower in the sky, Dillon reluctantly suggested they should return to town. The ride back was companionable, with Dillon pointing out features of the landscape and telling stories about the early days of settlement. At the boarding house, he helped her down from the buggy and walked her to the door. "Thank you for coming with me today," he said, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "I enjoyed it," Jessie replied honestly. "I'd like to see you again," Dillon continued. "Maybe next Sunday if you're willing." Jessie hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Good. That's good." Impulsively, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, placing a feather-light kiss on her knuckles before releasing her. Until then, Jessie. Martha was waiting in the parlor when Jessie entered, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Well, how was your afternoon with the most eligible bachelor in the territory?" "Pleasant," Jessie replied, unable to suppress her smile. "Very pleasant. Just pleasant," Martha teased. "The way he was looking at you when he helped you down from that buggy suggested something more than pleasant." Jessie felt her cheeks grow warm. "He wants to see me again next Sunday." "Of course he does," Martha said, satisfied. "That man is smitten, plain as day." "I don't understand it," Jessie admitted, sinking into a chair. "I'm practically a stranger here, unmarried and with child. Why would someone like him take an interest in me?" Martha regarded her fondly. "Because he sees what I see, a strong, kind young woman who's facing her troubles with dignity. That's rare, Jessie. Especially out here." Over the next few weeks, Dillon's Sunday visits became a regular fixture in Jessie's life. They drove to different spots around the countryside, or sometimes just sat on the boarding house porch talking while Martha discreetly busied herself elsewhere. Jessie learned more about him with each visit. How he'd lost his parents as a teenager and been raised by an uncle. How he'd saved for years to buy his ranch. How he treated his ranch hands fairly and was respected throughout the territory for his honest dealings. In turn, she gradually shared more of herself, her love of poetry, her dreams of traveling, her fears about motherhood. He listened attentively to everything, never judging, offering thoughtful responses that revealed a depth of understanding she hadn't expected from a frontier rancher. As her pregnancy advanced into its final month, Jessie found her work at the clinic increasingly tiring. Dr. Williams insisted she take more frequent breaks, and Dillon began stopping by during the week to walk her home, claiming he had business in town though Jessie suspected otherwise. It was during one of these walks, as September gave way to October and the cottonwoods began turning gold, that Jessie finally gathered the courage to address what they'd both been avoiding. "Mr. Calloway Dillon," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I feel I must be honest with you." He slowed his pace, looking down at her with those clear blue eyes. "I'm listening." Jessie took a deep breath. "I'm not a widow. There was no husband. The story Martha and I put forth was a kindness, to make my situation less scandalous." Dillon's expression didn't change. "I know," he said simply. Jessie stopped walking, staring at him in shock. "You know? Small towns have few secrets," he replied with a gentle smile. "Besides, you never speak of him, your supposed husband. A real widow would have stories, memories. And yet you've continued to call on me," Jessie said, bewildered. Dillon took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "Jessie, I don't care about your past. I care about who you are now, the woman who works tirelessly at the clinic, who's kind to everyone even when they're not kind to her, who faces each day with courage despite her circumstances." Tears pricked at Jessie's eyes. "The baby's father abandoned me when I told him I was with child," she whispered. "We were to be married, but he changed his mind." Anger flickered briefly across Dillon's features. "Then he's a fool," he said firmly, "and doesn't deserve another thought from you." They resumed walking, Dillon still holding one of her hands. After a moment of silence, he spoke again. "My coming to Copper Creek wasn't an accident, you know. After the war, I needed something new, something untouched by all that bloodshed and loss. The territory seemed like the answer." Jessie listened, sensing he was sharing something important. "I lost my brother at Gettysburg," he continued quietly. "We fought on the same side, but it didn't matter in the end. Death doesn't care which uniform you wear." "I'm so sorry," Jessie said softly. "After, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts. So I came west with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. Started over." He squeezed her hand gently. "What I'm trying to say, Jessie, is that everyone deserves a second chance. A new beginning. That's what the West offers, the opportunity to be judged by who you are now, not who you were or what happened before." They reached the boarding house, and Dillon turned to face her, still holding her hand. "I'm not good with fancy words," he said earnestly. "But I want you to know that I care for you deeply, Jessie Northup. And I'd be honored if you'd consider a future that includes me." Before Jessie could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and double over. "Jessie." Dillon's voice was alarmed. "What is it?" "The baby," she managed through clenched teeth. "I think it's coming." Without hesitation, Dillon swept her into his arms and carried her up the steps and into the boarding house, calling for Martha. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and fear for Jessie. Martha sent for Dr. Williams, who arrived quickly and pronounced that the baby was indeed coming, though perhaps a bit earlier than expected. Dillon refused to leave, taking up a position on the porch where he paced relentlessly, hat in hand, his face creased with worry. Inside, Jessie labored through the night, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Martha and Dr. Williams coached her patiently, their experienced hands guiding her through the process. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, bringing the first pale light through the bedroom window, Jessie gave a final, exhausted push and was rewarded with the thin, indignant cry of her newborn child. "A girl, Dr. Williams announced, placing the tiny red-faced infant on Jessie's chest. "A healthy baby girl." Tears of joy and relief streamed down Jessie's face as she gazed at her daughter. 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that, when they briefly opened, were a deep blue-gray. "She's beautiful," Martha whispered, her own eyes misty. "Absolutely beautiful." After cleaning up mother and child, Dr. Williams went to the porch where Dillon still waited, haggard from his night-long vigil. "Both mother and daughter are doing well," the doctor informed him. "You can see them if you wish." Dillon hesitated, suddenly unsure. "Would she want that?" "She asked for you," Dr. Williams replied with a smile. Removing his hat and running a hand through his disheveled hair, Dillon entered the house and made his way to Jessie's room. He paused in the doorway, his breath catching at the sight of Jessie propped up in bed, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at his entrance, her face radiant despite the exhaustion evident in her features. "Dillon," she said softly, "come meet my daughter." He approached the bed cautiously, as though afraid his presence might somehow disturb the perfect tableau before him. Jessie tilted the bundle slightly so he could see the infant's face. "She's perfect," Dillon breathed, awe evident in his voice. "Just like her mother." Jessie smiled, but there was a shadow in her eyes. "Not everyone will see it that way. A child born without a father—" "Hush," Dillon interrupted gently. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his eyes never leaving Jessie's face. "What's her name?" "Elizabeth," Jessie replied. "After my mother." "Elizabeth," Dillon repeated, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "It suits her." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as Elizabeth slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "Jessie," Dillon finally said, his voice low and earnest. "What I was trying to say yesterday, before we were interrupted. I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day in the clinic when you measured out laudanum for my ranch hand and didn't flinch at meeting my eyes." Jessie's heart swelled at his words, but practical concerns intruded. "Dillon, I have a child now." "A child with no father." Dillon's gaze was steady. "She has a father if you'll allow it." "If you'll allow me." "What are you saying?" Jessie whispered, hardly daring to hope. "I'm asking you to marry me, Jessie Northup. You and Elizabeth both. I'm asking you to make a family with me." Tears welled in Jessie's eyes. "People will talk. They'll say the baby isn't yours." Dillon smiled, a slow, sure smile that warmed Jessie from within. "Let them talk. They said that baby ain't mine, and I say then it's ours anyway." The simple, heartfelt declaration broke the last of Jessie's reservations. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding was a small, simple affair held in the town's modest church 2 weeks after Elizabeth's birth. Jessie wore a dress of pale blue made by Rose Sullivan, who had become a fast friend. Martha stood proudly beside her, and Dr. Williams gave her away. Dillon, clean-shaven and looking uncommonly polished in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off his bride. The minister, who had initially been reluctant to perform the ceremony, was eventually won over by Dillon's unwavering support of Jessie and baby Elizabeth. "I now pronounce you man and wife," he declared after the brief ceremony. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The small gathering of well-wishers, mostly Martha's boarders, Dr. Williams, Rose Sullivan, and a few of Dillon's ranch hands threw rice as the newlyweds emerged from the church, Jessie carrying Elizabeth carefully bundled against the autumn chill. They spent their first night as a married couple in the best room of Copper Creek's small hotel, with Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in a cradle that one of Dillon's ranch hands had crafted as a wedding present. "Are you happy, Mrs. Calloway?" Dillon asked as they lay together in the darkness, his arms around her. "More than I ever thought possible," Jessie replied, nestling closer to him. The next morning, they set out for the Circle C ranch in Dillon's wagon, with all of Jessie's belongings packed in her trunk and Elizabeth secure in a special basket Martha had prepared. As they left town behind, Jessie felt a sense of anticipation mixed with trepidation. She had only visited the ranch once before, shortly after Elizabeth's birth, when Dillon had driven her out to see what would be her new home. The main house was larger than she had expected, a solid 2-story structure built of logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Flowering vines climbed trellises on either side of the front door, and a kitchen garden stretched to one side. "It's not fancy," Dillon had apologized during that first visit, but it's sturdy and warm in winter. It's wonderful, Jessie had assured him, already envisioning the life they might build there. Now, as the wagon crested the final hill and the ranch came into view in the valley below, Jessie felt a surge of emotion. This was to be her home, her new beginning with the man she loved and the daughter who had become the center of her world. Dillon must have sensed her thoughts, because he reached over to take her hand, squeezing it gently. "Welcome home, Jessie." The ranch hands had prepared a welcome, hanging a hand-painted sign over the front door that read, "Welcome Dillon Calloway and baby Elizabeth." They stood in a respectful line as Dillon helped Jessie down from the wagon, then carefully handed her Elizabeth. "Boys, I'd like you to meet my wife, Jessie, and our daughter, Elizabeth," Dillon announced proudly. The men removed their hats, nodding politely. Jessie recognized a few from her time at the clinic, including Jim Hansen, the foreman whose wife Dillon had collected medicine for. "Madam," Jim said, stepping forward, "on behalf of all the hands, we want to say we're mighty pleased to welcome you to Circle C. The house has been too empty for too long." "Thank you, Mr. Hansen," Jessie replied warmly. "I look forward to getting to know all of you." The interior of the house revealed careful preparation. Fresh flowers stood in vases in the parlor, the floors had been recently swept, and the furniture polished to a shine. "Mrs. Hansen came over yesterday to help get everything ready," Dillon explained as he carried Jessie's trunk upstairs. "She and some of the other women from the neighboring ranches. They've been asking to meet you." "That was very kind of them," Jessie said, touched by the gesture. The master bedroom was spacious and airy, with windows looking out over the valley. A new cradle stood beside the large four-poster bed, with a colorful quilt folded neatly inside. "The women made that too," Dillon said, noticing Jessie's gaze. "For Elizabeth." Tears sprang to Jessie's eyes at the unexpected kindness. "I don't know what to say." Dillon set down her trunk and came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You don't need to say anything. They're good people, Jessie. They understand about second chances." The first weeks of married life were a period of adjustment for both of them. Jessie learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings, the constant work, the isolation that came with being miles from town. Dillon, in turn, adapted to having a wife and infant daughter in a house that had known only his solitary presence for years. He took to fatherhood with surprising ease, happily walking the floor with Elizabeth when she fussed at night and proudly showing her off to anyone who visited the ranch. The neighboring ranchers' wives called on Jessie, bringing gifts for the baby and offering friendship. If they had any thoughts about Elizabeth's parentage, they kept them to themselves. In the harsh realities of frontier life, judgments were a luxury few could afford. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in early November. The world outside their windows turned white and silent, limiting travel and essentially isolating the ranch for days at a time. Jessie found she didn't mind. The house was warm, her daughter was thriving, and her husband's love surrounded her like a protective cloak. They spent the long evenings in front of the fireplace, Jessie reading aloud from one of the books Dillon had surprised her with, or Dillon telling stories of his early days in the territory. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching Elizabeth as she began to show more awareness of her surroundings, her tiny hands reaching for anything colorful or shiny. "She has your eyes," Dillon observed one evening as the baby gazed up at him from her cradle. "Same shape." Jessie smiled, warmed by the way he always found connections between her and Elizabeth, as if determined to reinforce their family bond. "But she has your stubbornness," she teased. "Have you noticed how she refuses to sleep until she's good and ready?" Dillon laughed, the sound rich and warm in the firelit room. "Can't imagine where she gets that from." As winter deepened, their isolation grew, but so did their closeness as a family. Dillon taught Jessie to play chess, and she introduced him to the poetry she loved. They talked of the future, of the improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, of the education they hoped to provide for Elizabeth, of the siblings they might give her in time. When Christmas approached, Dillon rode into town despite the snow-choked trails, returning with gifts and supplies. Among the packages was a small piano for the parlor, a gift that left Jessie speechless with delight. "You mentioned once that you played," Dillon explained as she ran her fingers lovingly over the keys. I thought you might like to teach Elizabeth someday. That Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside and Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Jessie played carols on her new piano while Dillon sat beside her, his arm around her waist and his heart full to bursting with happiness. Later, as they lay in bed, Jessie whispered, "I never dreamed I could be this happy. When I left Boston, I was so afraid, so alone." Dillon pulled her closer. "You'll never be alone again, Jessie. I promise you that." The winter eventually gave way to spring, bringing new calves to the ranch and new growth to the land. Elizabeth, now 6 months old, was sitting up and babbling, her personality emerging more each day, stubborn indeed, but also sweet-tempered and curious about everything around her. On a warm May morning, as Jessie hung laundry on the line with Elizabeth watching from a blanket spread on the grass nearby, she saw a rider approaching. Shading her eyes against the sun, she recognized Martha Parker's sturdy form. "Martha!" she called, hurrying to greet her cousin. What a wonderful surprise. Martha dismounted with Jessie's help, then immediately went to scoop up Elizabeth. "Look how she's grown. And those cheeks just like fresh peaches." Over coffee at the kitchen table, Martha caught Jessie up on all the town gossip. Dr. Williams had finally proposed to the widow Johnson. Rose Sullivan's dress shop was thriving. And most surprisingly, Abigail Foster, the mayor's wife who had once crossed the street to avoid Jessie, had fallen from social grace after being caught in a compromising position with the new schoolteacher. "Serves her right," Martha said with a sniff. "After how she treated you." Jessie just smiled, too content with her life to harbor resentment. "How long can you stay?" she asked instead. "Just until tomorrow. Jim Hanson's wife is coming to fetch me. She's in town for supplies today." "I'm so glad you came," Jessie said, reaching across the table to squeeze Martha's hand. "I've missed you." "Are you happy, child?" Martha asked, her shrewd eyes studying Jessie's face. "Truly happy. More than I ever imagined possible," Jessie answered honestly. "Dillon is." She paused, searching for words. "He's everything I never knew I needed." Martha nodded, satisfied. "I knew he was a good man the first time he looked at you. Some things you can just tell." That evening, when Dillon returned from the south pasture where he'd been mending fences, he greeted Martha warmly and insisted she stay for supper. Over a meal of roast chicken and fresh vegetables from Jessie's kitchen garden, they talked and laughed, with Elizabeth adding her own nonsensical commentary from her high chair. As Jessie watched her husband and cousin together, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was her family now, not just by blood, but by choice and circumstance. The twisting path that had led her from Boston to this moment had been difficult, even painful at times, but she wouldn't change a single step. Summer passed in a blur of ranch work and domestic contentment. Jessie's garden flourished under her careful tending, providing fresh produce for the family and often the ranch hands as well. Elizabeth took her first wobbly steps just before her first birthday, toddling from Jessie's arms to Dillon's with a look of triumph on her little face. Autumn brought the cattle drive, when Dillon and most of the hands took the herd to market in Cheyenne. It was the first time he and Jessie had been separated since their marriage, and the 2 weeks of his absence felt interminable. When he finally returned, dusty and tired but successful, Jessie ran to meet him at the gate, Elizabeth on her hip. "Duh," the little girl called, reaching for him with eager hands. Dillon's face lit up at the new word. She's been practicing while you were gone," Jessie said with a smile. "She wouldn't say it until you were here to hear it." He swung Elizabeth up into his arms, his fatigue forgotten in the joy of homecoming. "That's my smart girl." That night, after Elizabeth was asleep, Dillon presented Jessie with a small box. Inside was a delicate gold locket. "It's not much," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "but I wanted to bring you something special." Jessie touched the locket gently. "It's beautiful, Dillon." "Thank you." "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny portrait of Elizabeth on one side and Dillon on the other, skillfully painted by an artist in Cheyenne. "Now you'll always have us close to your heart," Dillon said, his voice soft with emotion. Jessie kissed him, putting all her love into the gesture. "You've always been there," she whispered against his lips. As Elizabeth's second birthday approached, Jessie began to notice changes in her own body, subtle at first, but unmistakable as the weeks passed. The familiar morning sickness, the tenderness, the fatigue. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Dillon. On a crisp October evening, with the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, she led him to the porch swing where they often sat after Elizabeth was in bed. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. Dillon's eyes widened in understanding, then filled with joy. "Jessie, are you sure?" She nodded, her own happiness reflected in his face. "Due in early summer, I think." He pulled her into an embrace, holding her as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." Jessie knew what he meant, not that he loved Elizabeth any less, but that this child would be born of their love, a physical representation of their bond. "Elizabeth will be a wonderful big sister," she said, nestling into his embrace. Dillon nodded, his chin resting on top of her head. "She'll teach this little one everything she knows, which, at her age, mostly involves how to charm her papa into giving her extra cookies." Jessie laughed, her heart full to bursting with love for her family, the one she had now and the one that was growing. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Elizabeth, now a chatty toddler with Jessie's dark hair and expressive eyes, seemed to understand that something special was happening. She would pat Jessie's expanding belly and say, "Baby," with solemn importance. By spring, Jessie's condition was obvious, and the neighboring ranchers' wives again rallied around her, bringing baby clothes they'd outgrown and offering advice for managing with two little ones. Dillon, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing the nursery, which would now need to accommodate both Elizabeth's small bed and a cradle for the new arrival. He built shelves for toys, painted the walls a cheerful yellow, and even attempted to craft a rocking horse, though the results were comical enough that he eventually commissioned one from the carpenter in town. In late June, as the summer heat settled over the ranch like a warm blanket, Jessie went into labor. This time, Dillon sent for both Dr. Williams and Martha, determined that Jessie would have the best care possible. The birth was easier than Elizabeth's had been, shorter and less complicated. Just as the sun was setting, painting the bedroom in shades of gold, Jessie gave birth to a healthy baby boy. "Daniel," she whispered as the newborn was placed in her arms. "After your father." Dillon, who had remained by her side throughout the labor despite Dr. Williams' initial objections, wiped tears from his eyes at her choice of name. "He would have been honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elizabeth, who had been staying with Mrs. Hanson during the birth, was brought in to meet her brother the next morning. She approached the bed cautiously, her little face serious as she studied the tiny bundle in her mother's arms. "Baby?" she asked, pointing a small finger. "Yes, sweetheart," Jessie replied. "This is your brother, Daniel." "My baby," Elizabeth declared, reaching out to touch his cheek with surprising gentleness. Dillon lifted her onto the bed so she could see better. "That's right, princess. He's our baby, just like you're our baby." The look of pure love on his face as he gazed at his family, his wife, and two children, made Jessie's heart swell. This strong, kind man who had accepted her and Elizabeth without reservation, who had given them a home and his name, who had never once looked at her daughter as anything other than his own, was the greatest blessing of her life. As the years passed, the Calloway family thrived. The Circle C Ranch prospered under Dillon's management, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Jessie, drawing on her experience with Dr. Williams, became known throughout the region for her knowledge of herbal remedies and basic medical care, often treating minor injuries and illnesses when the doctor couldn't be fetched in time. Elizabeth grew into a confident, intelligent young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's steadfastness. She never questioned the circumstances of her birth, secure in the knowledge that she was loved completely by both parents. When she was 12, Dillon and Jessie sat her down and told her the truth about her origins, wanting her to hear it from them rather than through gossip or speculation. "Does it matter?" she had asked simply after they finished their careful explanation. "Not to us," Dillon assured her. "You're our daughter in every way that counts." "Then it doesn't matter to me either," Elizabeth declared with the certainty of youth. Daniel, strong-willed and adventurous, grew to be the spitting image of his father. Two more children joined the family over the years, another boy, James, and finally a girl they named Martha, after the cousin who had given Jessie shelter when she needed it most. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dillon surprised Jessie with a trip to San Francisco, something she had always dreamed of but never expected to experience. The children are old enough to help Jim Hansen keep the ranch running for a few weeks, he insisted when she protested leaving. And you deserve to see a bit more of the world. The trip was everything Jessie had imagined and more. They attended the opera, walked along the bay, and marveled at the bustling city so different from their quiet ranch life. On their last night in the city, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room watching the lights of the harbor, Dillon wrapped his arms around Jessie from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Happy, Mrs. Calloway?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night so many years before. Jessie leaned back against him, content in his embrace. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. Though there were silver threads in his once golden hair and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they met, to her he was still the most handsome man she'd ever known. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Taking on another man's child, marrying a woman with such a complicated past?" Dillon's blue eyes were serious as he cupped her face in his hands. "Jessie, from the moment I first saw you in that clinic, measuring laudanum with those steady hands of yours, I knew you were someone special. Everything that followed Elizabeth, our marriage, our life together has only confirmed what I sensed that day." He kissed her gently, a kiss filled with the depth of feeling that 20 years together had built. "The only regret I might have had would have been letting you slip away." Back at the ranch, with their children grown or growing and the future stretching before them like the wide Wyoming sky, Jessie often thought about the twisting path that had led her to this life. The scandal and shame that had driven her from Boston had ultimately guided her to a place where she was valued not for her social standing or conformity to society's rules, but for her character and strength. And Dillon, her steadfast partner through it all, had never once made her feel that she or Elizabeth were anything less than a blessing in his life. True to his word that day on Martha's porch, he had made them a family, his family, without reservation or regret. On warm summer evenings, they still sat on the porch swing, watching as their grandchildren, Elizabeth's two little ones, played in the yard. Daniel, now working alongside his father to manage the ranch, would often join them with his young wife. James, away at college in Denver, wrote regularly of his studies and adventures. And Martha, their youngest at 16, sat at Jessie's feet, listening to stories of the early days. "Tell us again how you and Papa met," she would plead, though she'd heard the story countless times. And Jessie would begin, "I was working at Dr. Williams' clinic in Copper Creek when a tall rancher with the bluest eyes I'd ever seen came in asking for laudanum for his injured ranch hand." Dillon would listen with a smile, occasionally adding details or gently correcting Jessie's embellishments. When she reached the part about Elizabeth's birth and his proposal, he always reached for Jessie's hand, his thumb rubbing gently over her wedding band. "They said that baby ain't mine," he would quote himself, "and I said then it's ours anyway." The simple declaration, spoken from the heart all those years ago, had laid the foundation for everything that followed, a life built on love, acceptance, and the courage to begin again. In the wild frontier where Jessie had once arrived alone and afraid, she had found not just sanctuary but a home, not just a protector but a partner, and not just acceptance but a love that transformed everything it touched. As twilight deepened into night and the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Jessie leaned her head against Dillon's shoulder, surrounded by the family they had created together. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the hills, and closer by, the soft laughter of their grandchildren rose like music on the evening air. "I love you, Dillon Calloway," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of decades shared. "And I love you, Jessie Calloway," he replied, his voice strong and sure as the day he had first said those words. "Always have, always will." In that moment, with the ranch quiet around them and their family close, Jessie knew with absolute certainty that the journey that had begun in fear and uncertainty had led her exactly where she was meant to be, home, in the arms of the man who had loved her and her child without condition or reservation, who had given them his name and his heart, who had seen past her circumstances to the woman she truly was. It was more than a happy ending, it was a life well lived, a love well tended, and a family bound together not just by blood but by choice, by acceptance, and by the everyday courage of hearts that recognize in each other a place to belong.